Hello, hello. Welcome, everyone, as you're connecting to sound, joining the Zoom room. Welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 906th New Social Environment. I'm Carolyn, a Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the extreme pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Megan No and Sarah Odenkirk and Yayoi Shionoiri. We are thrilled to welcome poet Kimberly Kruge here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. Here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but serve as a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land we are speaking from. And now to introduce today's guests and host. Megan No co-chairs Prior Cashman's Art Law and NFT groups, with nearly 20 years of combined in-house legal and private practice representation of collectors, artists, and other stakeholders in both the traditional media and digital art sectors. Megan negotiates a wide variety of art market transactions and advises on disputes implicating copyright and artists' rights issues. Sarah Odenkirk is partner at Cowan DeBaets Abrahams and Sheppard LLP and co-heads the Art Law Practice Group. She represents clients in matters pertaining to fine art transactions and intellectual property, emerging tech, business affairs, and strategic planning and public art and policy. And our host today, Yayoi Shionoiri, is an interdisciplinary art lawyer and art historian who lives in Brooklyn. As executive director to 1717 Studio, she stewards Chris Burden's art historical legacy and promotes Nancy Rubin's artistic practice. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and I will turn it over to you, Yayoi.
Thanks so much, Carolyn, for that wonderful introduction. Thanks also to the entire Brooklyn Rail team, Chloe, Eleanor, Georgia, as well as Fong and the Brooklyn Rail for having us today. And thanks so much, everybody, for spending their afternoon or morning hour with us. Again, my name is Yayoi. I had the incredible honor of serving as the critic for the guest critic page of this month's Rail issue titled Art Law and Art and the Law. And we'll talk a bit more about that feature in a moment. With me today, I am deeply honored, as always, to share the stage with two of my dear art world friends and art law experts, Megan No and Sarah Odenkirk. As introduced by Carolyn, please continue to read their illustrious bios, look them up online, follow them on LinkedIn, Instagram, all over the internet, read everything they write, and if you ever need specific legal advice in the field of art law, please consider looking them up. Today, we're going to take a mini dive into what I think remains a very hot topic in the general interest world around us, as well as within the art world, namely AI or artificial intelligence. Specifically, we're interested in looking at the intersection of the current US copyright legal framework and the currently more publicly available AI tools that use large language models and text-to-image generators. And because Sarah, Megan, and I are all lawyers here, I would like to include this disclaimer that this conversation is not meant to be taken as either specific or general legal advice. So even though this talk is being recorded, it's highly speculative, and each of us is speaking from our own personal opinions. And as the tech continues to change very rapidly, so likely will our opinions. But I did think that it would be interesting and important to have a snapshot circa end of September 2023 of that very intersection between copyright and AI, and for us to share with everyone a sense of what art lawyers have been thinking about in this realm. A little bit of additional background and context, if I may. The critics page of the September issue of the Brooklyn Rail about art and the law features an incredible gathering of some of the most thoughtful, am I still on Zoom? Sorry, some of the most thoughtful, incredible art lawyers working in the space, like Sarah and Megan, but also Alana Kushnir, Melissa Passman, and Ryan Sue, as well as highlighting artists who often use the law as a medium, or in fact, sometimes even contests those guardrails. And those artists are Alchemyverse, Jonas Lund, Jill Magid, and Rupa Vasudevan. Megan and Sarah both independently contributed wonderful thought pieces to the critics page. But as a trio, we worked together in a number of other contexts, including presenting at symposia and writing articles. So we know the difficulty both of birthing creative work, but also doing it in a collaborative way that also feels fair. Those are actions I think some of you in the audience who are artists probably do as well in your own practices. An example of an article that we wrote together is for Professor Charlotte Kent's Brooklyn Rail Critics page about art and tech in May of 2023. In response to Charlotte's prompt, we decided to think about the idea of human touch and technology, and human touch in technology, and what that intersection actually looks like. Because regarding the currently developing precedent as to the copyrightability of AI-generated work in the United States, the degree of human involvement and the type of human involvement is one important vector of legal analysis. Today, we hope to be building upon some of that analysis, especially as a bit more time has passed since we last wrote that article together. Now, addressing straight on the elephant in the room, I think, is the fears about AI. Generally, for example, these are some of the fears that I've been reading about. One, for example, that AI will become so much more intelligent than humans that it will be uncontrollable, right? For example, prompting extreme protest groups like Pause AI. Another example, to the point that the UK is hosting a global summit on AI safety in November. So at the country level, countries are starting to think about what sorts of guardrails might be needed to protect both users as well as the general public when it comes to utilizing AI tools. Another example, corporations are hiring ethicists to think about what it means to use AI in their work streams. What does it mean in terms of fears of AI in the world that we live in the art world? Specifically, as it relates to creative production and artists, some AI models have already ingested a large amount of copyrighted material. So that potentially leaves artists whose work has been ingested with potentially no recourse. Another aspect, artists feel like at some point that these AI tools might become so powerful that their livelihood might be at stake. So I've been talking a lot. I want to bring our wonderful other speakers into the room, please. So Megan and Sarah, a gating question for both of you. One, how are you personally feeling about AI? And two, what do you think are some of the pros and cons of AI as it relates to the creative industries? I know that's a large question. Who wants to go first?
I think Megan wants to go first.
Oh, okay, Megan. Megan, how are you doing, Megan? How are you?
Hi. I guess I will say as a disclaimer before I say anything else that I know this is entitled a speculative conversation. I'm sort of here in a just the facts ma'am kind of role. I will be doing less speculating and more provision of black letter law and information about the legal landscape that underlies all of this. So it will not surprise you to hear me give a very lawyerly response on how I'm feeling about AI, which is that I think it has some really exciting potential opportunities that it offers with respect to even just mundane daily life, things like figuring out formulas in an Excel spreadsheet for me and doing, helping me with things that I don't like doing in my daily life. And also, of course, in the creative sector. But it's also a little bit unsettling that the technology seems to be developing more quickly than either the legal rules or the ethical guidelines or industry practices around ethical use. So, I think we'll explore some of those implications and legal issues in this panel, but kicking it over to Sarah.
Great. So my disclaimer is that my law firm is on the most recently filed lawsuit, so I have to be a little bit careful about my comments as they relate to the analysis of the law, which Megan can certainly cover for us. So I'll be more speculative. In general, how I'm feeling about AI right now is that we're still in the gimmick and discovery phase. I think that people are finding it, excuse me, a very interesting game to play. People are enjoying playing around with it, seeing what it spits out. It's funny, it's interesting, it's weird. And so we're still sort of playing with that, the ability and pushing those boundaries to see what it can create. I'm afraid that, there are some places where that's less appropriate than others. Obviously, for university settings, we don't want students to be using AI to generate answers to exam questions and that sort of thing. On the other hand, in medicine, in scientific research, there are some amazing opportunities to use this technology to do some incredible things. I think, in fact, this morning I just saw something about how the CIA is going to launch their own AI platform in order to help solve crimes. Great, that's wonderful. In terms of how it impacts artists, though, I think is really a very interesting and complicated question. And I do hope that we spend some time thinking about future impacts and not just about right this second, can I copyright this? Can I not copyright this? Those are important questions, of course, but sort of to your point, Yayoi, about how there are some fears around what the implications and impacts of AI are going to be. I think we really need to be very forward thinking, and that's why having these speculative type conversations are crucial. It needs to be more than just what laws can we apply, but where could we possibly see this going? I think we need to start applying some futurist thinking to the possibilities around AI.
Yeah, no, thanks so much to the both of you. And to pull out some of the skeins that I'm hearing from the both of you. One, Megan, thank you for making that distinction, that there is a distinction between the legal and the setting of legal guidelines versus the thinking of ethical aspects of what's happening around us. And then Sarah, thanks also for identifying that even though the law is in some ways a slowly developing body or precedent-based system, especially in the United States, in some ways this might be the moment for all of us to kind of continue to put on our sorry, that was kind of a loaded term, more like a futurist, as you said, Sarah, way of thinking about what potentially this AI is doing while it's changing, so that we still have a way to think about all of this. I want to now turn to Megan specifically for a while. Megan, this is your opportunity to kindly enlighten us and drop all the knowledge that you would like. Megan has deep subject matter expertise in so many legal areas, including areas like copyright. So, Megan, on to you. Please give us what you see are the salient updates to the legal lay of the land regarding copyright issues as they relate to AI. I know that's a large question. If you'd like to talk about output issues first, that's great. Or if you'd like to talk about input issues, that's fine too. But maybe a reminder for our audience about that distinction might help too.
Sure. So output is what an AI tool, either on its own or as prompted by a human, is actually generating as artistic end product. So for example, images that are generated with Midjourney as prompted by a human, that would be considered output. Input is what data is being fed into an AI system, and we'll unpack that a bit in a moment, but data that's being used to train an AI tool or serve as a point of reference for what that model understands photos or paintings or other creative work to look like. And there are interesting issues on both sides. So thinking about output side first, there have been a series of instances in which the US Copyright Office has denied copyright registration to individual human beings who have applied for registration of creative works that were generated with the assistance of AI. I'm going to take a step back and do just a tiny bit of copyright 101 here, because I suspect some of our audience isn't entirely familiar with the significance of what a copyright registration is. And in fact, under US law, if you as a creator generate original work product that's not copied from someone else, and your creative work product is fixed in a tangible medium, meaning if it's a drawing, that it's committed to paper, it's not just in your brain. If it's a digital artwork, it's saved to a computer file. It's not just ephemeral on the screen, or again, a concept in your head. If you've done all of those things, if you've generated an original creative work that's fixed in a tangible medium, then generally speaking, you already have a copyright in that creative work. Your copyright protection exists from the moment of fixation. But when you register your copyright with the US Copyright Office, you do a couple of things. You put the world on notice of your authorship and your rights. You make yourself available to be able to start a lawsuit to enforce your rights if someone is infringing them. And you also make it possible for a court to award you something called statutory damages if you win an infringement suit, meaning that the infringing party might have to pay you money based on an automatic penalty scheme that's baked into the statute. So there are benefits to registering a copyright in a lot of cases. And that's exactly what some folks tried to do this year, register copyrights in certain creative works that were created using AI to various extents. So let's start with the first and possibly the most famous of those, because it's been going on for a couple of years actually. A computer scientist named Stephen Thaler built an AI model called the Creativity Machine. And he used it to generate an image of sort of an archway covered in these picturesque purple flowers. He filed a copyright registration application in 2018. So he was ahead of this curve, seeking to register that image. It's important to note that when he filed his application, he listed the Creativity Machine, the AI model itself, as being the author of that image. And then he described the image as having been autonomously generated by that technology. Then lastly, he listed himself as a claimant to the copyright under a work made for hire theory. Again, understanding that this audience is probably not a super technical copyright audience, I think the best way I can explain that is to analogize to, it's sort of like Mr. Thaler saying that he viewed the Creativity Machine as his employee, and he claimed that he was entitled to ownership of any copyright in the machine's work product because he was the machine's boss. Well, the Copyright Office didn't go for that theory, and they cited long-standing precedent that copyright ownership can only be recognized for human authors and can't be awarded to machines. There's another famous case involving a monkey taking a picture, and similarly, in that case, copyright was not awarded to a monkey because a monkey is not a human. So Mr. Thaler asked the Copyright Office to review that decision several times, and after their third denial of his application for registration, he actually asked a federal court to review the Copyright Office's decision, and that court reached the same outcome on the same grounds. So now we have definitive judicial precedent on that issue. That's not actually a particularly surprising outcome, though, since Mr. Thaler was so clear that he played no role whatsoever in dictating the creative choices that the Creativity Machine made in generating the particular image. A little bit of a more interesting case is the work of Chris Castanova. And Yayoi and Sarah and I wrote about that together in the, I thought it was April, maybe it was May issue of Brooklyn Rail, which is linked in the chat box, the article called Touch that Yayoi spoke about in her glorious intro. Thank you for that belatedly, Yayoi. So Chris is a digital artist who has now submitted 2 different applications to the Copyright Office for registration, and they each raise different interesting questions. The first of Chris's applications was for a graphic novel called Zarya of the Dawn. Chris used Midjourney to generate the images for that graphic novel, going through hundreds or maybe even thousands of iterations of those images and refining them with complex text prompts before culling down a set of images that was used in the graphic novel and arranged by Chris in a characteristic graphic novel format, as well as incorporating text that Chris wrote as the dialogue for this graphic novel. At first, the Copyright Office apparently didn't appreciate that Chris had used Midjourney in creating the images, and they granted a copyright to the entire graphic novel. After some internet buzz started building about first copyright granted to AI images, which is considered very newsworthy to a certain community, the Copyright Office got wind of that and solicited further information from Chris. Chris's response acknowledged the use of Midjourney, but noted that they had engaged in this painstaking prompting process and had also modified some of the images afterwards using Photoshop. Ultimately, the Copyright Office effectively canceled the portion of the copyright registration that applied to the images, but allowed Chris to keep a copyright in the layout and the text. The office's decision spoke to their view that Chris hadn't exercised sufficient control over the output, which is exactly the issue that the 3 of us addressed in our Touch article. And I think I'll put a pin in that because we plan to come back to that at the end of the panel. But ultimately, this decision said, you haven't met the requisite level of human control. And so Chris set out to test that further with their next copyright application, which was for a work called Rose Enigma. Chris created this second work using Stable Diffusion, a different AI tool that operates using both text and image prompts. Specifically, Chris uploaded their own hand-drawn image of flowers growing out of a partial humanoid or cyborg face, and argued in their copyright registration application materials that they had used Stable Diffusion, this AI tool, in a method that is more akin to Photoshop, adjusting the image incrementally in layers, focusing on things like coloration gradient or focus and depth of field, and fully controlling that tool to produce the desired output. The Copyright Office's decision on that registration is still outstanding, and I totally take Sarah's point that copyrightability or not of AI-assisted or AI-generated artwork is not the full scope of interest for this panel, but that's the rundown on what decisions have been made or are still pending with respect to copyrightability. And again, we'll come back to the concept of human control. Let me talk quickly about the input side. As I said, that's really about data sets that are being used for machine learning or to train AI and hone the way in which different AI models can generate output as being informed by existing creative works in the world. And we get into a whole different set of legal issues here. And there are several lawsuits pending as well. First is a case that a group of authors, one of whom is the comedian and author Sarah Silverman, have filed against Meta in federal court in California. The authors are claiming that the company's AI model, which is called Llama, was trained on data sets that were illegally compiled from basically like sites that pirate their actual published books. Relatedly, another group of authors, including Jonathan Franzen, is also suing OpenAI in New York federal court, alleging that ChatGPT was trained on their works. And they've reached this conclusion because when prompted, ChatGPT can produce these accurate summaries of their books. So they've deduced that that must mean that ChatGPT was fed the actual books to learn from. This sort of begs the question of what AI tools are actually doing with the pre-existing copyrighted material that they may be ingesting as learning data sets. And I can't speak for everyone on this panel, but for me, that's a bit of a black hole. Different AI tools work in different ways, but from at least a technical copyright perspective, it really matters whether someone's copyrighted text or image is actually being reproduced or distributed versus whether a tool is perhaps just like perceiving that material as it is hosted on a third-party site. So I think as these litigations develop, that's one thing that I'm going to be watching for, is better factual development and articulation of how these different technologies actually operate and what they're doing with the underlying learning data. Another case I want to mention briefly in the input category is the lawsuit that was filed by Getty Images against Stability AI. Getty is accusing Stability of copying more than 12 million images from its famous photo database without permission or compensation. Getty has made copyright and trademark infringement claims. And the latter type of claim is maybe a little bit more of a slam dunk, because in some of these Stability images produced allegedly from the Getty database as a training set, you can actually see the Getty logo watermark. So that's kind of a dead giveaway. And that case is actually happening in parallel in the US and the UK, because Stability has a UK parent company. And then just in the news yesterday on a site called The Verge, which is great for tech news, I saw that Getty has released its own AI tool called Generative AI by Getty Images that lets people use prompts to create AI-assisted images derived from licensed images within its database. So we'll come back to that at the end as well, because I think we're going to try to end with some, what do we see coming down the pike and what are some solutions? The last case that I'll mention, and then I promise my lecture is over, is another class action that was brought by 3 visual artists as the lead plaintiffs. They're also suing Stability AI. And the thrust of the lawsuit is that the Stable Diffusion tool generates images that the artists believe improperly imitate their recognizable style and aesthetic as a result of being trained on their actual works. As I mentioned a few moments ago, infringement of artists' work through use of their work as input data is going to depend on what the tool is actually doing. And there's been some criticism with respect to this legal complaint that it doesn't totally correctly or accurately break down what they think is happening there. They sort of describe Stable Diffusion as being like a collaging tool. But coming full circle to the output issues that I started with, I'm actually also really interested in the infringement claims that the artists are making about these stylistically similar Stable Diffusion outputs. In order for one image to violate the copyright in another image, they have to be substantially similar. And the artists in this case haven't pointed to any of the Stable Diffusion results that are alleged to specifically copy the composition of an underlying original work by the plaintiff artists, or even they haven't been able to identify a specific Stable Diffusion output that sort of collages elements of their original works together into a pastiche. Overall, the argument seems to be that by logical conclusion, they must, their works were part of the training data, and therefore the output must be derivative of their work. They're also saying that the output effectively competes with their own original work in the market because of this stylistic similarity. But that's a really, really tricky area, because generally copyright law doesn't protect your recognizable style or aesthetic. It protects individual compositions and specific creative elements within them. That same issue is coming up in a case that doesn't involve AI at all, but is an art world case that some of the audience may be familiar with, involving the traditional media artists, Deborah Roberts and Lynthia Edwards. Basically, Deborah is accusing Lynthia of violating her copyright, but also infringing her trade dress. Now, trade dress is a claim that you more commonly see in the consumer product context. For example, in relation to like really recognizable packaging designs or color schemes. So if you see a brown truck go by with a gold logo, you're going to assume it's a UPS truck. If you receive a package of fries that's like a red box with a curved top and a yellow logo, you're going to assume it's McDonald's. That's what we generally consider to be recognizable trade dress. And I just wanted to point out that there are some really interesting parallel legal conversations happening about artistic style as something that may or may not be protectable. And the Stability AI case is going to have to reckon with that, as will the art world more broadly. And that's something that we see in even traditional media cases in terms of how an artist community might rally around them through social media and how buyers respond to a work that they may feel is imitative of another artist's style. And I think that brings us right back around to some of those ethical questions as well. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Megan, for that. I feel like I'm back in law school, but even better. How do I even summarize what you just went through? I can't probably, but just kind of to remind people at sort of a high level, some of the things that I heard was, one, thank you for making the distinction between output issues and input issues. Two, I'm noticing that with respect to the fact patterns of all of these cases and registrations that are coming up, we're really seeing that different artists really are utilizing AI in different ways, and that maybe currently the US copyright framework doesn't necessarily have all of the requisite tools to fully understand or analyze how these tools are being used. And then finally, this factual point that many of us, I think, don't really, I mean, I don't want to make assumptions, but I most certainly don't fully understand what happens with respect to these AI tools when I put in these language text prompts or these images, I feed them in. It's sort of like hard to actually understand what's happening to the material that I'm in fact putting in. So I know that there's a lot still to come, but so appreciate that intro. Let's now turn to Sarah. Sarah, thank you so much for your patience here. Want to start first with something that I read about earlier this summer. So in front of US Congress, Sam Altman of OpenAI fame testified and said something to the effect that he generally agrees that content creators deserve control over how their creations are used, and said, quote, a minimum is that users should be able to opt out from having their data used by companies like ours, close quote. So, Sarah, what do you think are some of the legal guardrails in this realm that you think are needed, either existing already or are needed to support artists?
So you raise a really interesting question, this question of being able to opt out. And I think that from the creative artist side of things, the preference is to be able to opt in instead of opting out. So the idea that you could, after the fact, say, oh, you know what, I don't want my stuff used, can you take it out? I'm not even sure technically, and I'm definitely not an expert in the technical side, but I'm not even sure it's possible to just extract certain things, because what we have are models that are based on putting content into a matrix. And then it's the computer itself that, or the AI itself, that is doing the machine learning off of that information and creating its own algorithms and figuring out its own ways of using that information and creating the output that we were just talking about. So the ability to opt out seems to be not necessarily a very effective tool or way for artists to protect themselves. It's too late. The horse has already left the barn. And I think unless they're going to retrain the entire model, that's not going to be a particularly effective way of supporting the protection of the artists. Instead, I think an opt-in model would be better, which is that people have the ability to proactively designate their work as being appropriate or allowable for ingestion by these AI models and used in the training data sets that are put together by the companies. Right now, we don't really have any laws that pertain to that. I do think that we're going to have to start looking at where the liability is for the models versus the users, and that will be an interesting question to see evolve. Already, we're seeing some efforts on the part of the AI companies to push that liability to the users and say, well, you know, we're just creating this product or this service, but we're not creating the output. That's the user's problem. And that the user then becomes the party that's liable for any infringing output. I'm not sure that that's going to fly. It really shouldn't fly. It should be, in fact, the responsibility of the AI companies that take on that part of the equation. In addition to input and output, I think that there's a general issue around transparency. So right now, as Megan pointed out, we have a number of different kinds of models, and Yayoi, I think you made this point as well. People are using the AI models differently. The AI models are constructed differently. So it's not just one massive homogeneous engine that we can be looking at. We're talking about all different kinds of structures that are in place. And in a lot of cases, they're not open source, they're black box. Even the people who built them don't know exactly how the AI is using the information that it ingests, and they don't really know exactly how it's coming up with the output. So figuring out ways to improve the transparency overall within the ecosystem would be really crucial. Again, not being the tech person, I don't have any specific technological suggestions to affect that, but I think as a concept, it's a really important thing to be considering. Beyond transparency and opt-in, I think that we also need to be looking at tools to credit or compensate the artists whose work is used, and let's assume that it's being used with their permission. There still needs to be a way of managing that, and we can talk a little bit more about that as we get into the more futuristic part of the conversation. But I do think that it will be very important to focus on tools and mechanisms. This may be where blockchain could be an interesting crossover point in terms of managing those rights and making sure that artists are properly compensated for the use of their work. And in general, you know, in terms of the laws, we're all struggling, and we're struggling on both a national and international basis to grapple with a lot of these questions and the implications of what these tools and models mean. So a couple of things I would say, just again, to sort of set the groundwork here for the more futuristic conversation, which would be to look at the way in which we allow these models to develop. So requiring that they use licensed content, requiring that they use only public domain content, requiring that they use original content created specifically for the purpose of being ingested into an AI model. Looking at some of those possible ways of restricting the growth and development and evolution of the AI models would be one thing to look at. We are going to have to look at all of this from an international perspective, though, and not just in the US. So I think it's very important to think about not just the rules in the US that apply, but the rules that apply in other jurisdictions as well. And as Megan properly pointed out, in the United States, we do not protect in the style of for artists. And that's an interesting conversation in and of itself. In other countries, that is protected, or there is more protection for that kind of a claim and that kind of a concern. And so figuring out how do we navigate that on an international level so that we don't push the less scrupulous AI users to other jurisdictions in order for them to, you know, make use of this interesting technology. I will stop there and let you ask your next questions, and hopefully we can keep this moving along.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sarah, for that. A small group of interested parties in the music industry, CSAC, the International Confederation of Societies of Authors and Composers, they released a statement in July that covered some of the things that you talked about. For example, figuring out what it means to provide a liability mechanism for AI operators, asking that pertinent question that you yourself, Sarah, also asked, you know, likely to have an effective opt-out system for rights holders, but how in fact do you do that when the technology has already taken off, right? But one of the things that they said in the statement that I think is very interesting is this, quote, AI models should be considered as simply an instrument at the service of human creativity, right? End quote. And this, I think, starts to go a little bit more towards the human touch point that I think all three of us grapple with and sort of danced around and discussed in our article, but also something that we talk about when we think about the copyrightability of AI generated works. And so, Sarah, one more question for you. How do you think about the AI, using AI as a tool that artists can use versus other types of tools that artists currently use in their practice? Is there a distinction or not, and why?
So this is a really interesting question, and it goes back to what Megan was telling us about the Casanova case in part. And yes, I mean, I think that there are so many different ways to enter into this conversation. One is that we have historically had other technological evolutions and innovations that were treated as being unfair or not leading to copyrightable work, such as photography. And that was one of the cases that the Copyright Office actually relied on to distinguish the way in which AI is used versus the way that a camera is used. I think that you might find a difference of opinion with regard to the way artists are viewing AI and using AI. I think artists do look at AI as a tool that they are using and manipulating. And again, it's going to depend on the way in which the AI actually works, the way in which the prompts are treated by the AI and the output is generated. But the difference being that the Copyright Office was looking at the prompts as being simply suggestions to the AI, and that the AI is making the decision and coming up with the output based on the AI's determinations, not the artist's determinations. I think that that is going to have to be examined further, and it is going to depend. Again, we're talking about such a wide range of ways in which the technology is being used, as well as the technology's ability, depending on the different model and platform that's being used. And the question will be, and this goes back to our article on touch, if the artist is in fact using many, many different prompts and truly shaping the output of what the AI is generating, that seems to me to get much closer to one of the more traditional artistic tools, whether that's a camera or Photoshop or any other mechanism that artists use in order to create their output. So I do think that there's going to have to be more examination of AI as a tool. I don't think that we're going to be able to make blanket proclamations about, AI is always a tool or AI is never a tool. I think there's going to have to be some differentiation in terms of the use. And that brings me to sort of the ethical and non-legal questions that I think are really, really crucial to be asking as we go through this analysis, which is, who's using this as a tool? Who's using AI? Why are they using AI? What's the purpose of using this as opposed to some other mechanism to generate output? What is the output being used for? So all of these questions that go to a little bit more of the human aspect of the interaction with the technology are very important as we figure out not only how to create guardrails and laws around this, but also how do we want to see this technology evolve over time? If it is indeed going to be used as a tool in any of the realms that we've talked about, science, art, technology, writing, anything, we really need to be paying attention to what do we want this to become? How do we want this to be used? And what power do we want to give this this technology that is truly quite powerful?
Yeah, thanks so much for that. And then maybe in our sort of remaining time together, maybe let's open it up to the both of you. Again, to iterate, and Megan, please correct me if I'm wrong, no US court has yet to definitively address what level of human involvement is needed to ensure that a human artist is given copyrightability to an AI generated or AI assisted work. There's lots of precedent that is developing, but there is no definitive rule, like black or white rule so far. So given this, what do you think each of you is enough human touch for a human artist to more likely guarantee the copyrightability of their AI assisted or AI generated output? Speculative, not general or specific legal advice.
I guess I'll just say that I found Chris's most recent application for Rose Enigma, which was, drafted by some great attorneys we know, to be very compelling in presenting the use of Stable Diffusion exactly as Sarah just spoke to, as being more akin to a traditional tool like Photoshop. That was very specifically responsive to the Copyright Office's comments in their prior denial to Chris of a different work by Chris. So, that is an interesting use of the legal system to engage with pushing where is the boundary. And I look forward to a decision on that application, because I think it won't be, universally instructive, but it will give us some better sense of where the Copyright Office perceives that line to be.
Yeah, and I actually think that the Copyright Office is relying on their past decisions and past guidance in order to address these current issues, which is understandable, and it's not clearly wrong. But I think that the using the same guidance, which essentially is the same way that the Copyright Office looks at derivative works created with underlying public domain work, or other works that are derivative of stuff that's already in the public domain. That's not really what's happening here. I mean, you can make that logical argument if you say that everything coming out of AI is not copyrightable, therefore there's no copyright that can apply because anything coming out of AI is a derivative of something that's not copyrightable. It ends up being a little bit circular. And I don't think that we should be looking at AI in the same way that we are looking at photography and other tools. That's not to say that I don't think AI is a tool. I do think that it can be used as a tool, but there needs to be a much more precise set of guidelines around what makes something copyrightable or not. So in the Copyright Office's guidance, what they've said is that if you want to get copyright protection, if you want to have your registration granted, you have to indicate that you've used AI in the process. And then you have to indicate those things that were added that were not AI generated, that were human generated. And that's the portion in which you're going to have your registration granted. Again, that's the same way that they view derivative works made on the basis of underlying public domain work. But I think that in this case, the line becomes much fuzzier and much more difficult. Now, the Copyright Office is not making decisions based on actually analyzing the content that's being submitted for registration. They're going based on your representations on the application for registration. So I'm not sure that the Copyright Office is necessarily the correct place for all of the policy and guidelines and regulations to be generated from. I think that that needs to be a much broader conversation that goes beyond the boundaries of the time.
I just want to pop in and add a couple of things. We had a question in the comments asking to explain what a derivative work is. So I'm going to do that really quickly. A derivative work is when a author one has created a copyrightable work. Let's say Lynn Goldsmith has created a photo of the artist formerly known as Prince and then known as Prince again.
Never heard of her.
And then a secondary artist does a new work that incorporates some or all of that pre-existing work, but they also contribute their own original expression. The result, the second artist's work, may be considered a derivative work, which requires the first author's permission to make it. And if it's a derivative work, then the secondary author artist will only, as Sarah just said a moment ago, they will only have protection in the part of the secondary work that they themselves contributed. However, the line between a derivative work and an infringement is a really fuzzy line. And if you don't have the primary author, the first author's permission, and you incorporate their material into your secondary work, you might be making a fair use argument, right? And the concept of fair use is that, among other things, and it's a whole multi-factor test that's the subject of a different engagement session for us, maybe another day. But the concept of fair use, one of the aspects of it is that your secondary use has transformed the primary work in terms of its meaning or intent or its overall expressive purpose. So when you look at something like Andy Warhol transforming or deriving his portrait of the artist formerly known as Prince from a Lynn Goldsmith photo, you can see how it becomes very difficult to distinguish what is a derivative work versus what is fair use. So I think, as Frank in the comments asked about both of those concepts, we unfortunately cannot really unpack them fully in this conversation, but you're right to home in on those because they are really tricky. And then the other thing I want to just briefly mention, because Sarah mentioned that the Copyright Office guidance requires applicants for AI-assisted works to disclose their use of an AI model or tool in their application. Look, like, that requires good faith. That requires people to be good actors. And I think we are going to be embarking in a world shortly, if we're not already there, where people may have incentive to apply for things and not disclose and get a registration that could later be invalidated. But that creates an issue around, if you are being accused of infringing someone else's work, and that work maybe wasn't entitled to registration in the first place, how do you then prove that their work was created with the assistance of AI in order to invalidate their registration? And I think there's some really interesting technological tools developing around that. There's a thing that Google's DeepMind team has developed called SynthID, I think, which is meant to embed like a secret watermark in AI created images so that they can be identified using certain scanners or tools. So I think we're getting into a very weird world, and it relates back to the question about, what are we going to require as a market, as a community, in terms of artists who work with AI disclosing that media or that tool, versus what are going to be the legal requirements? How does the law respond? How does the market respond? And those things might diverge.
Yeah, thanks for that, Megan. Let's actually move to some additional Q&As in the chat. Really interesting stuff happening here. And one of them, I think, is quite similar or talks about a slightly different ethical situation, but along the same topics that you are talking about, Megan. It's from Anne. Anne says, what do you think an artist's obligations are to disclose to collectors whether AI was used in the creative process? And I'll go first. As somebody who gets to work with living artists in my day job with Nancy Rubens, for example, I do not believe that Nancy has any legal obligation to inform her collectors. That having been said, she does not use AI currently for her sculptures, but maybe there's a distant future that she might. If anything, I don't think there is a legal obligation, but maybe for art historical medium purposes, I wonder if it made sense in the tombstone caption to include that, in fact, AI was utilized as, in fact, just another tool. But again, I don't think there's a legal issue there. There might be some interesting ethical or art historical issues there. Sarah, Megan, do you have any thoughts to that question?
Well, I'll just say that, again, it's going to be jurisdictionally specific. And Yayoi and Sarah and I have a text chain called Wilson Phillips. But Yayoi texted us last night sharing with us a legislative development or proposal for legislation in France. And one of the key features of that legislative proposal, which seems to be consistent across what a couple of different European jurisdictions are proposing, is that anything authored with AI would be legally required to disclose the use of AI. But, I don't know that the US will go there. And if we do go there, I would think it would come up potentially under more like Lanham Act or deceptive trade practice type of bodies of law with respect to what consumers think they're getting versus what they're getting?
I think that's actually a really crucial point, because my question is why? Why do we need to reveal that something has used AI in the process? And I think that there are so many different answers to that question that could impact how you would want to regulate that or legislate that. What I thought was very interesting about the legislation that you were referring to, Megan, that Yayoi shared with us, is that not only was there a requirement to disclose the use of AI in the creation of the work, but there were also some mechanisms that seemed to favor the use of collective societies, unions, guilds type of organizations in collecting money. So figuring out different ways to compensate the artists that people may or may not agree with in terms of that structure. But I definitely think it's an interesting concept to think about the larger ecosystem. How do we want to impact the way that artists create, live, exist within this world, and are credited and compensated for their work? Is there an opportunity here for us to think about different systems that go beyond the systems that are currently in place and that we currently go to sort of reflexively every time we think about copyright infringements or how we're going to deal with the integrity issues, Megan, that you touched on as well? I think we need to really consider, in the previous insanity that was going on the last few years around crypto and NFTs, we ended up now seeing that there is regulation through enforcement. That's sort of a reactive way of approaching. I really think that we need to be looking at proactive ways of approaching this and thinking about how we want to help it evolve in a way that we like, as opposed to waiting to figure out ways in which we can apply existing laws or strengthened laws to what's happening.
Great, thanks so much for that. There is robust discussion in the chat. Let's please keep it all in friendly tone, please. Super appreciate that. I think we are coming up against time, so I wanted to thank everyone for joining us, for being in community with us, for being so active in sharing your thoughts with us. We very much look forward to staying in dialogue and in community with everybody in the art world as these issues continue to develop at the intersection of AI and copyright. I hope everyone has gotten their copy of this month's Rail. If you haven't, please jump online to read it. Please follow Megan and Sarah on IG, Twitter, I guess now known as X, and LinkedIn. I'm also very, very happy to receive feedback and comments about the critics page, either on IG or X. And now I believe I'm turning things back over to Carolyn to introduce our very human poet, Kimberly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yayoi and Sarah and Megan, and thank you all for your wonderful questions and engagement today. And sorry we couldn't get to all of them. So yes, here at the Rail, we do have a tradition of ending with a human poetry reading, and I'm so thrilled to welcome Kimberly Kruge here to the virtual stage. Kimberly Kruge is the author of 2 full-length collections of poetry, There's Something They're Not Telling Us and Ordinary Chaos from Carnegie Mellon University Press, and a chapbook, Highland Subtropic, which won the Center for Book Arts Prize. She's the founder of Casa Comala, a forthcoming free-to-use residency space in Mexico for artists of all disciplines. Thank you so much, Kimberly, for being here. I'll turn it to you.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for organizing and emceeing this event. And I'm honored to be here with Megan, Sarah, and Yayoi. And it was an extremely interesting conversation, so I'm glad to have been present for it as an artist. And a few days ago, I heard a friend of mine, well, I overheard a friend of mine describe my work as something that is about the experience of being human. So I do think this is a fitting way to end the talk on AI. And these poems that I'm going to read today are from a new series I'm working on, for which the conceit is the place where a kind of unexpected quotidian magic happens that in turn spurs a kind of existential threat. And the poems are titled as such, Place Where, every last one of them. Place where I cry in a public bathroom, cry at a dry fountain, cry about the art. Later at some dinner party, I'll say the fountain is the greatest thing I've ever seen, and someone will tell me I haven't lived much. But you understand it, why someone would cry over art and also not cry over art but oneself, the devastating fact that only something external can describe us. The day before, the day I met you, you traced my bones as if drawing a plan, and then I was part of one. You knew how it worked. You lean in as we stare into the parched painted pit, and wind turns gears that pull air into pipes, and the hollow fills with the enviably geometric sounds of nature. Imagine if they knew. That's what you whisper at the museum, near strangers, and yet I sat on your lap naked before the bathroom mirror. Near strangers, and yet you told me to pass you that, and I knew it was a black shirt. You don't need to say anything more, but you can't help yourself, and I know how it works. If only they knew that. Place where we swig champagne from someone else's refrigerator and I braid your hair. From across the street, someone in an office tower watches me plait your locks grown long with glee, with opulence, your head in the crook of my neck under a rubber tree, and asked you that afternoon, how are you? And you said, happy, so happy. Hate us, we tell the watcher, us with borrowed robes and stolen champagne. Hate us, we told the taxi driver when you dried my rain-wet shoulders with your cloth bag. Hate us for my hand in your pant waist in the back seat. Hate that we sate ourselves on wine and sweat and roll in bed, glutted, your head in the crook of my neck. How are you? You whine my name and my heart shoots up with a gasp. You know too much of a good thing will kill you. Place where there's a sustained horn note emanating from straw-burnt fields, and no one in town stops to listen but us. I used to make a joke about the apocalypse, about if the trumpeters weren't any good and it was the last thing anyone ever heard on Earth. But this note is greasy and thick, the call of a well-oiled instrument. It is the apocalypse, the music is good, and we are standing, if not ironically, at a large open gate, a place where you've taken me, a place to which we've driven in silence, a church to which we've come with no other motive but to look at how one wall covering hides another, frescoed saints dismembered by plaster, a beehive over the Virgin's crown, straw rusting from bricks. Soon we are ignoring the horns to stillness under a tree, your tongue ripe in my mouth, my hand knotted in your coils. What earthly gifts? Bell tower toppled in the last quake, scaffolding under the altar, a bedsheet over the monstrance, like a body in a costume playing ghost. Place where you say if I go out now, I can see the Milky Way, so I walk across wet grass in the middle of the night. I see it. Days later, I will watch a fine crescent sink into the sea, moonset, a wonder I didn't even know existed. There are more. When you wear my sweater in the kitchen as I push food around a pan, when the sky turns a color only light understands and we crane our necks, where the horse is in the same field as the last time, nosing wildness, and the houses still stand on the hill, and the lake looks to have the same level of water, identical surface to the one I hold in my head, where I crawl into myself after a bad joke and we heave with laughter, and once we catch our breath, I open my legs on your face. The aperture of the bedroom is enormous, and I think if I were an onlooker in the trees, not just then, but the entire day, I'd say, who wouldn't want what they have, what we call it, what you and I need, meeting in the woods. Place where you float on your back, so buoyant the sea folds into you, into the hang of your bent knees, holds your head. You are doing something that you had to figure out. In the place where we saw an eagle ray and a fish with pointed teeth, who protects your body, long fingers and gentle shoulders. I practice looking away, and every time I turn back, you are in the same position but a different place. What guides you? The beacon of your head quieted. I practice looking out, making a conjecture about the horizon I'll tell you later. Now you're by the boats moored to a line. Place where you, self-possessed, read in a woven chair after we've returned from a place where light shot through termite holes and wooden shutters, encouraging a constellation. Yes, I will call the work of pest stars in a room where dark was not a state, but itself. Before bed, we walked the town and the sky was not anything but a color I won't even try to name. We visited every well, read the plaques, how one man stole another man's meat, murdered for theft, the water running red still, likely silt. We shook it off. Later, with you on top of me, all I could see was your shoulder, all but a curve of light. It's a fact I'd known, but that closed in on me then. Shutter the windows and our bodies disappear. Thank you very much.
Wow, Kimberly, thank you so much. That was such a cool, interesting way to end this conversation, actually. Really wonderful to hear your work. So thank you. And thank you so much to Megan and Sarah and Yayoi for this dialogue today. We would also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. For the past 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has provided a platform for the arts, culture, and politics through our free monthly publication and public events like our daily NSE. Please check the chat for a link to donate to support the Rail. And join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a poetry reading curated by Joshua Escobar, featuring Michelle DeTore, Mel Elberg, Jody Lynn, and Vivian Storm. And as is Rail tradition, you can now all turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks,
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, you all.
Conversation
Bye.
today.
Thank you.
Go Wilson Phillips.
Kimberly. It was so beautiful.
Great reading, Kimberly.
Poetry was
Thank
so
you,
beautiful.
Kimberly.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
For the rest of your days. Yeah.
Thank you.